Hi, everybody. I am really pleased to be hosting this session about social audio. I'm pleased to welcome Sanatu Saka, who is the editorial project manager and specialized journalist from RFI and France 24. And also Matt Adams, who is the audience engagement person, guy, go-to at NPR. So my name is Sarah Toporov. I am on the Radiodays program group. And for the past 2 years, every time we meet to define what are the most important things to talk about in audio for the next year, we're like, so what are we going to say about Clubhouse? And nobody really knew. And then sort of this year we realized we were kind of asking the wrong question. So the question that I want to ask, and this is why I invited these speakers here today, is how are newsrooms building audience engagement by meeting users where they already are? And how are they finding new ways to use the voice and to use interactive platforms to create meaningful and valuable interactions between the newsrooms, between the media and their audience? So that's what we're going to hear from. Sanatu is going to tell us first about her projects, and then we're going to hear from Matt, and we are going to hopefully have a really long, in-depth chat, and we would love to hear your questions, so please start thinking about them.
Hello, I'm Sanatu Saka, and I'm really, really happy to be here to talk WhatsApp, the new venue for audio broadcasting. I'm editorial project manager at digital department for France Média Monde. This is a group with RFI, France 24, and MCD. Yes. Let me give you a few information about WhatsApp. WhatsApp created in 2009 and acquired by Facebook. This is 1 billion users worldwide, specifically in Africa. WhatsApp represented 10 billion messages sent per day, and it's very high potential in countries where SMS is a paid service. In Africa, WhatsApp booming with voice note because we have several people who can't write French or English and use this function to send a message. So how can we use? I choose 2 shows in our catalog to illustrate our utilization. And this is 7 milliards de voisins. This is a daily show about society, culture, thematics. And a production team use WhatsApp every day. This is the main source of listeners' contribution. We have today more than 4,500 numbers in different lists. And every day we're sending subject of the next episode show. And in the afternoon of day, we send link to listen the show. WhatsApp contribution represented 15 to 20% editorial content. Another show, this is Appel sur l'actualité. This is a daily show about news. This is a very big show for us. Production team use WhatsApp every day. Today we have 17,000 numbers in different lists. This is a very big. We're using WhatsApp status to push content, send summary show, and call off contribution. This is a capture of one message. The format is very simple. We have a short message and interactive format, and a few and more we listen tone. We use emoji. This is one message per day. So how can we promote this project? We use social media. We post message on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and announcement in the show. So every day, a presenter announcement WhatsApp number in the show. This is a very important. And we have cross-promotion in another show of broadcast. We have many challenges of this project. It's very difficult for us to sign manually to several lists, to updating of lists. We have a limitation of lists because WhatsApp authorizes 250 numbers per list, so we have limitation. We have few stats reporting because people shared in different groups and we don't have reporting. This is a very big time working for producer to send message, and time sending is very slowly if you have many lists. It's not easy to develop a new format. A possible solution today, we envisage to externalization of sending message, create a specific budget, recruitment of new resources, develop a tracking solution of content to have a statistic and formation of teams because this is a specific format. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Matt Adams. I work at NPR, and I'm from Washington, D.C. This is my first time in Sweden, in Europe in general, so I'm very new to the jet lag. And I woke up so things are really different here in the sense that I had to wake up at 1 in the morning to watch the Pittsburgh Penguins play the New York Rangers. Pittsburgh is my favorite hockey team. I'm originally from Pittsburgh. They lost in overtime, and then it was 4 a.m., and I'm like, what do I do now? So it was very new to me that sports here in America are on very late and different times, but I think we'll still have a good presentation, even though I'm a little sad about that. So what I'm going to talk to you about is how NPR is using social audio to engage with our audience, to engage with new audience members, and to build out a conversation with our audience. So we're not so much talking at them, we're talking with them. And we've been using the tool Twitter Spaces to do this. So what is Spaces? So you might have seen this. You might have been on your Twitter mobile app, and at the top, they call it the space bar, and you might have seen some circles happening up there, and you can actually join into what it is, an interactive audio conversation. It's a new tool that Twitter has just created in the past year, and it's basically a way for our followers to join in and be a part of a live conversation with our reporters, with experts, with special guests, and just to have kind of this conversation about anything that's happening in news, whether it's breaking, a trending news story, a special guest interview, and it really is almost like the call-in format of a radio show, but what I love about it is how easy it is to launch a room and to get people in on the conversation. So they don't have to wait to pick up a phone. They can just raise their hand in the room, we bring them up to the stage, and they can talk from there. And this is what a Twitter Spaces room looks like, just as simple, with the speakers at the top and some of your audience below. Why are we using this tool? So for one, it's a way for us to reach our North Star goal of engaging with younger and more diverse audiences. We have this goal across all of NPR.org, and I'm sure some of your other media orgs or the companies you work for have this goal of just reaching a younger audience. This is one way we're trying to do that. You can also record a space, and it can be repurposed as either another podcast episode, it could be bonus content for a website, or it could be put on air live. So we've had a live moment on Twitter Spaces, we've recorded it, and then we used it for Morning Edition, for All Things Considered. We've rebroadcasted it somewhere else, so it's reaching an even larger audience there. Story ideas can be generated from Twitter Spaces. Sometimes when we call up the audience and they have a question or a thought, sometimes they'll say, hey, do you know about this? And our reporter will be like, no, but that's a good idea and we should cover that. So then we get an idea for a story that breaks out of there. There's also a way to collaborate with a lot of member stations. across NPR. Across America, we have many different cities with member stations that are broadcasting NPR work, and they have their own Twitter accounts. So we've invited some of those accounts into a Twitter space to have a conversation with us about something happening in their community. When I started doing this, I realized it was a great way to tap into the local reporters who could tell us what was happening in a neighborhood or community, and I did this with the Derek Chauvin trial. When that was happening, Minneapolis Public Radio was covering everything in the courtroom, what was happening, updates from there. So I decided to start having a weekly Friday chat with reporters there on Twitter Spaces. And by having it every Friday, I realized the audience started to grow because a lot of our audience members were joining and saying, oh, I'm getting like this live in-depth coverage, I'm getting updates, they can ask questions about what's happening there, and they expected it every week. It was like a TV show. It was like every 3 o'clock on Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, we're gonna do this conversation, and people were just waiting for it. So we actually started to grow the audience from there. Our audience becomes part of the conversation, talking with them, not at them. We also introduce our reporter to a larger audience and offers transparency with our reporting. Probably across the world at this moment, I think journalism is going through this issue where a lot of people might not trust the news. They might not trust local news. But what's happening here is I feel like we can break down transparency, and reporters can start to share how they worked on stories. They can have this conversation with the audience about how they worked on a story, what sources they talked to, and then the audience gets to learn more behind the scenes of how stories came together. And also, this gives us a chance to give the mic to different reporters around the newsroom. So when you're on listening to NPR, you probably know Ari Shapiro, Rachel Martin, the people who are always on Morning Edition or ATC. Those are the stars of NPR. But we have a whole newsroom of people that we never really hear from except for a digital article. I want to hear their voice. So I'm starting to pass the mic around and having different people host Twitter Spaces. It doesn't have to be hosted by a radio person who's on all the time. It could be hosted by a reporter, it could be hosted by a product manager, it could be hosted by a lot of different voices in the room who can offer more of their opinion and expert advice on something that's happening in the news. This is just a look at how we've been doing for the past year with audience growth. So February of 2021 was the first time I ever ran a Twitter Space, and I did it with the Code Switch team, and we were talking about their fellowship. And we had never tried this, just an experiment. I think 70 people showed up for this conversation. They got to ask questions about what the fellowship was, how to apply for it, and just have a back and forth with the Code Switch team. We started to grow around March and April when I started to bring in stuff like I talked about the Derek Chauvin trial, but also our politics team. People on NPR Twitter love to talk with the NPR politics group. So when we had Biden's first 100 days in office, we had a conversation about that. Anything that was going on with the Supreme Court, they wanted to jump into a conversation with that. So we started to grow from there. In November was when we had a whole week of Twitter Spaces where every day we had at least 3 conversations happening there, which just continued to grow the audience there. And then in March of 2022, we tried this thing for the first time where we had the State of the Union address, and we pumped in live audio from the State of the Union into a Twitter Space. They were able to hear Biden's address, and then afterwards, we had an open Q&A with our audience about what we just heard with the NPR politics team. So that's just a different way that we're using it and just getting creative with it. But we've seen a growth within the audience. The audience is starting to show up these conversations because we're doing them regularly. It's like building a community. It's going to take time, but if you have patience and you're doing it every day, the audience will get used to it, and then they want to be involved with whatever you're doing, a conversation or reacting to an article. They're going to be there to have that talk with you. So like I just said, we ran the State of the Union. The idea was we'd run live audio from the speech into a Twitter Space, and then afterwards we would have this conversation with the audience and just know what was happening there. And as the conversation, listening to the live audio from President Biden, the audience was growing. We started at 3,000, we were at 4,000, we were at 5,000, we then got to 10,000 people just in this live room. Now, also, we got a lot of tweets at us from people in the audience who were like, I don't have cable, and this was the best way for me to hear this. They just wanted to hear the speech, but they didn't know how they were going to find it, and we were giving it to them where they were on Twitter. Now, we also recorded this whole conversation, and then it replayed on air later, so that went out to an even larger audience. So that just makes it part of the whole ecosystem of our content, is what we're doing with some of these rooms. Interviews with impactful guests. We've turned a lot of our All Things Considered in Morning Edition guest interviews into Twitter Spaces that are then recorded and later put on air. So the idea here is that, so we had Matthew McConaughey, he had a book coming out, and at the time he was talking about running for governor for Texas. He's not doing that, kind of thankful for it. But at the moment, this might have been breaking news. He might have talked about it. He might have said he was going to run for governor. So we were like, if there might be breaking news here, this might be important. People might want to join the conversation. Another thing that we're thinking about is people who follow Matthew McConaughey on Twitter might not follow NPR. They might not follow Scott Simon, who is hosting this conversation. This way, when you're hosting a Twitter Space conversation with whoever it is, when they're in the room talking, their followers get a notification that they're in this room. So those might be new followers that you've never met before or don't know about the work you're doing. They can then start following you, your branded content account. They might start following your reporters. It just starts to grow your audience in a way. So this is something else that we've thought about doing, and we've started to host more conversations. We've had Pete Buttigieg, we've had Andrew Yang, we've had a lot of different people from the Biden administration join in. This is just something that we're going to keep trying to do. So we're trying to work with more special guests to have them join. They already have a Twitter account. They have a large following, so let's just bring them in here and have this conversation. Also, we've noticed that breaking news works really well in this moment. So anytime you see something trending on Twitter that's like in the moment news people want to talk about, you can start a space about it and people will jump in and want to talk about it. The war in Ukraine, when Russia invaded, we were doing Twitter Spaces about that right away, and people wanted to get some updates. We had people on the ground who were joining the Twitter Space to give us some more information from NPR. That was something that we were working with. Also, anything with Supreme Court, like when Stephen Breyer had announced his retirement, that got announced at like 9 a.m., and by 10 a.m., we were in a space talking about it with Nina Totenberg, who's one of our expert reporters who's always covering the Supreme Court. And the thing about these rooms is I'm not really scripting these conversations for people like Nina Totenberg or Scott Detrow. I'm just telling them, hey, these are the top line things we want to talk about, but I want you to come into this room and just openly have this conversation about it, because we're really going to be here to talk to the audience. And where the conversation really gets impactful is bringing the audience to the stage and getting some of their Q&A, because then you don't know what they're going to ask, and I know it's Twitter, and that could be a really wild thing, but I'm actually really surprised that we don't get trolled in these rooms. There's not like a lot of issues we ever have. Usually the conversation is great, and usually there's some great questions that are asked. I don't know if it's because you have to actually talk and hear someone's voice, but it actually works out. So we've not really had any issues with that. And anytime there's anything breaking, I'm always thinking, oh, how can we do a space? Like, we're going to go on air and have a breaking moment as well. But if there's another reporter around the room who could jump on Twitter and have this, I want to have this conversation there as well. We can record it and maybe use it later for something. This is a little bit more about the What's Next series that we had done. So during the week of 11/29, NPR hosted and produced 11 events on Twitter Spaces that involved 12 of our member stations. This was something where we were trying to tap into more youth audiences, and we were basically asking them questions about what more content they wanted to see at NPR. Stories about LGBTQ, climate change, stuff that we knew that the younger audience was interested in, so we were holding conversations about it. What that equaled in at the end, we reached more than 25,000 audience members. The average running time of a space was around 52 minutes, cumulatively 579 minutes, and the average engagement of an audience listening time was 45 minutes that would hold onto a space to be there to ask a question, to talk to our reporters. So that was just some of the thinking that we had around this. So we're trying to do this more weekly spaces, more things that are happening throughout the week so that the audience can join in and be used to it and then just expect it to happen so that they then want to join in later. So some of the steps that you might need and takeaways here for what make this successful for you. We run a lot of tests. I do it on my own personal account where I'll invite people in. We test some different things. We're testing live audio. We've done a lot of tests with that just to see what works and what doesn't. Find a topic that will be interesting to your audience. We've done things like the Throughline podcast series. I had a talk about capitalism that did very well. We've done talks about Biden's first 100 days. We also had a talk where we brought in the U.S. Surgeon General to just answer vaccine questions and vaccine rollout questions, and that did very well. So we did a weekly series with him where he was talking to an All Things Considered host. We would bring in the U.S. Surgeon General, and then we'd bring in the audience, and we would ask like one or two questions, but we really opened it up to the audience. And then they started to jump in and ask questions from there. We've also found this a great place to find new sources for stories. about a year ago, there was a hurricane that hit New Orleans. We had the local station there, WWNO, jump into a conversation in Twitter Spaces, and some of the sources that were jumping up on the stage, or like audience members, were asking questions that we thought, oh, this could be a story. This should be someone we interviewed, so we would direct message them later. So this is another great way of connecting with that audience. Try to go to the audience Q&A early. It's one thing to hear your experts talk, but if they talk for a while and you don't really get to the audience, that doesn't make it as part of the conversation or as inclusive. It just becomes just talking at them. We want to get them in that conversation. We want to have the back and forth, so we try to go to Q&A a little bit earlier if we can. I create a doc where I kind of line out the bullet points of what we're going to talk about, but I don't script these, like I'm saying. I just give them a couple lines of what we need to talk about. I want this to be as natural as possible, which is sometimes a little tough. We're NPR, you know, we have scripted, we have hosts and questions that we're going to ask, but I always try to figure out how this can feel more like a natural conversation you're listening to. We schedule spaces, the best times we found out in the afternoons between 3 and 7 p.m., but that just works for NPR. As you try to experiment with this, you'll have different times that work for you. And basically, while I'm doing this, I'm playing the producer role. I'm hosting the room, but everyone else, the reporters, they're just jumping into the conversation. They don't have to worry about the moderation or anything like that. I'm playing that role. So I have a Slack channel that I communicate with when we're ready to go to the audience, and where we're at with time, if they have an issue with a mic. I'm handling that on that side. But for the most part, reporters just have to show up and talk, and that's what's so great about this. And you can start this from your branded account, or your reporters can start this from their own personal accounts and invite other reporters to join in, or other people from other orgs. You can collaborate. There's a lot of different ways to like really experiment with this that's really worked for us. So that's stuff that we've kept in mind while we've been doing some of this. So this is just some of the tips for success I have that maybe takeaways that you might want to, if you want to try Twitter Spaces, these are some things to think about.
Thank you both very much. I am wondering how, so you mentioned that you chose to be on WhatsApp because that's where your listeners are. Did you consider other platforms?
Yes, we use Instagram because it is a very good platform for us. But in Africa, WhatsApp is the first social media, so we focus on WhatsApp.
And how did you choose to focus on Twitter Spaces? Were you an official launch partner with NPR, or how does that relationship work?
No, so when they started to launch the tool out, only certain verified accounts had it, so they gave it to a lot of news orgs. But we weren't really like a partner. They were just like, here, experiment with this if you want to do. We started with Clubhouse, and we did some talks there. But what worked for me on Twitter Spaces was our reporters were already on there. They had already built their followings. And I thought, OK, this is something they already know how to do. They're already tweeting out their stories. They're already talking about their stories. They're comfortable here. Then let's see what we do when we have a conversation there, because they already kind of know how to use the app. We just got to advance it to use this tool on there as well.
And you mentioned, I think that's great that you haven't had too many issues with trolls coming on. Have you had any security issues? Because WhatsApp, I mean, Twitter is arguably friendly-ish to journalism. WhatsApp is not at all. Have you had any issues with security or with people pretending to be RFI?
Yes, this is a very huge issue. All numbers of our listeners, we have a very secure list to protect them. And we have, this list is very updating every month to protect. We have a discussion with Facebook because, Meta, because Meta owned WhatsApp, to have a very secure dashboard to send a message very quickly and protect all numbers. Yes.
And you have one?
No. It's very complicated, but a discussion is very interesting because we think if we want to grow our numbers, we need to discuss with WhatsApp, with teams, with firms, because for us it's a very big platform, And yes, we don't have another plans of the moment, but we continue a discussion to improve our services.
So right now you have hundreds of lists that are 256 people.
Yes.
And you just have to send them in waves and batches. Yes. And why is that worth it? Because it is so difficult. But what is the value? Why do you bother?
I think WhatsApp is a private message for people. And with our audience, we consider we have a relation more closely with this audience if we use WhatsApp. So this is a platform for us to have a message, more qualitative message, because on Facebook we have many messages, but it's not very qualitative. And on WhatsApp we have very, very many messages, more qualitative, more interesting. So yes, I think this is a work in progress.
And are you sending folks, either on the Twitter Spaces or on WhatsApp, are you sending folks back to your owned and operated platforms a lot? And so, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that both of your news organizations have the goal of bringing audiences to your own websites and apps. So how does that fit in with this off-platform work that you're doing?
Yeah, so in Twitter Spaces, you're able to pin links in the room. So I'll pin a lot of links to stories that we have that we're talking about in that moment. Or if a reporter mentions something previously they had done, we'll send somebody there. Or if we're introducing a new podcast or a new series we want them to subscribe to, we will include a link there and tell people that this is where you can go to listen to the show or to hear maybe the rest of the conversation if it's going to be rebroadcasted onto air. We do have a way to kind of drive them somewhere else if that's what we plan to do. Whether audiences will leave that, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I think there's nothing wrong with also building off of your own platform there and just start to grow your audience. You want to pick up more followers. You want your reporters to pick up more of a community and build out their followers. So this is a good thing to do there as well.
Sorry, I just glitched. And are you sending folks to the RFI website through WhatsApp?
Yes, we send many links, but we remark it's not very working because our audience wants a message. It's not, yes, links is not working, but a message and status, WhatsApp status is very working for us. But yes, links is not very interesting for our audience.
So the status, like the WhatsApp story,
yes.
kind of? Okay.
Yes.
Very interesting. And how many messages a day are you sending for, like, for example, one of your shows?
Okay. We have many shows, but 7 milliards de voisins send 2 messages per day. And Appel sur l'actu, I think 1 message per day, yes.
And what is, like, for 7 millions de voisins, what are the 2 messages? How did you find the right things to ask at which time?
Yes, the first message is just a call of contribution to the next episode. And the last message, this is the end of the day. This is just a summary and recap of this emission with highlight citation, with highlight words of this show. And I think Appel sur l'actu, it's just call of contribution.
And you're getting folks sending WhatsApp voice notes directly to your newsroom, or are they calling?
No, we receive many WhatsApp voice notes to construct our show. But no, we don't send voice notes, but we receive many voice notes, yes.
Have you thought about distributing audio on WhatsApp?
The data is not very cheap in Africa. So if we need to download a voice note, it's very tricky. So we send a very simple message for our audience because it's not easy for them to download.
And I'm wondering if you have run into any challenges when you're trying to hand these tools over to journalists, most often radio journalists? Have you had any friction internally when you're trying to get somebody on to this space and they're like, this is just radio? Like, stop teaching me how to talk to an audience live, or how does that kind of work?
When I first pitched this, everyone was like, we don't want to do this. And I was like, okay, hold on, so I started doing a test with I'm very DIY, grew up on a lot of punk music, so I was like, all right, we'll just do it ourselves and figure this out in the way. So I just started to go to teams that would say yes and be like, let's experiment here. And I think when we started to see some success, a lot of our reporters started to get interested because there was something there. The other thing that reporters really like is how easy it is to join a conversation. When it's broadcast or a Facebook Live or any other video that they have to work on, there's a whole setup to it. They have to have what the location looks like, what they look like, what's going on behind them. With this, it's just on their phone and they're just talking into it. And I feel like how quickly you can set up a room and get someone in. I have a lot of reporters who tell me, oh, this is so much easier than trying to do a two-way or trying to do a live video. I actually really enjoy how quickly we're able to get this and start talking. And then when they get a back and forth with the audience and they realize they're not getting yelled at or there's not someone trying to troll them and they're just having this open conversation, some of them really find it fun and they think it's very interesting to try to keep telling stories this way or try to engage with our audience. So at first there was a little bit of pushback, but I feel like as the success has started to happen and we started to have a great feedback from the audience, more of our reporters are up for doing this.
And I'm curious to learn more about how these social audio ventures enrich a lot of the rest of your editorial. You both kind of mentioned it a little bit, but I was wondering, Matt, if you had an example of a moment that happened on Spaces that was broadcast after?
Yeah. So, of course, I brought up the Matthew McConaughey interview, and that originally was made for just Spaces, but then because he gave us some quick quotes there, we actually recorded that, and it later went to All Things Considered. I use this example as well, where this actually started on broadcast, but became such a big talking point that it became Spaces and became a digital article. But Steve Inskeep did an interview with Donald Trump, and it was the first interview that Donald Trump had done with NPR. We don't know why he wanted to do this around this time, recently, but he decided he wanted to. He called into NPR. They had an interview. It lasted about 10 minutes. He talked about the election was a fraud. Steve Inskeep said, no, it wasn't. And then Trump hung up. And then we're like, okay, that's all we had from that. But then everyone on Twitter started to talk about this story. And they're like, what happened? Like Steve Inskeep's awesome. He pushed back on him. I want to talk to Steve about this. So I was like, you need to get on Spaces and talk to the audience about how this all worked out. So then we went from a broadcast to a Twitter space that was based off the broadcast. Steve went in there, talked to the audience about how the interview came about, what happens when you push back to someone who's trying to spread a lie, and then the audience back and forth that we had there. And then we turned that into a digital article later about the Spaces conversation we happened. So Spaces just doesn't have to live there. It can be repurposed across to other parts of your website, to on air. You can find different ways to have that and make it work so it feeds into the entire ecosystem. And
can you record within Twitter? That you can record the Twitter space? That's a function that they offer. Yeah, they now do that. And I will say the audio sounds pretty decent. When I've given some stuff we've had on Spaces that then became an audio show later or went to broadcast, our team is like, no, this sounds pretty good. They had to do a little bit of tweaking, but not that much. And we've had stuff air later in the day or later in the week. So it's actually worked out to kind of produce a quick audio clip that we want to share later. And Sanatu, you mentioned that you're working on developing a show that's going to be recorded entirely on WhatsApp. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
No.
Just a teaser.
Yes, just a teaser. I can't telling, but yes, we have a project. This is a show entirely with voice note, WhatsApp. So yes, that's all. And it's... I can't tell too much.
Stay tuned. But it's journalism. It's an interview.
Yes.
Yep. Fabulous. I'm very much looking forward to it. What questions do all of you have? Can we get a mic over here, please?
Yeah, it's a question for Matt about NPR and kind of it's known for creating really innovative apps of its own making and design, like NPR One. And I just wondered if you think the way that you use Twitter Spaces at the moment could only come from being on Twitter, or whether there's any thinking about we would love this to be in the NPR app. We would love to have more control over it and drive users there. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is something that we're starting to think about, like how we can bring this to our website, how we can bring this to some of our apps like NPR One, where you can listen to a lot of clips from shows or full episodes from other member station podcasts. This is something that we are trying to figure out, like how do we have a conversation with the community there, and if there's a way to build that tool. So it is something that we are starting to talk about. But right now that hasn't really moved forward, and it's really just going to stay on Twitter Spaces for now. But this just, to me, opens up ideas of like, what else can we do? Like we pumped in live audio, like I talked about with the State of the Union. What does the future of that look like? What other conversations can we have? How quickly can we spin up conversations? I'm just thinking about what the next step is beyond that. And we're just trying to experiment as much as possible and see what works and what doesn't within there.
Who else would like to ask something about, would anyone like to tell us what you've done in social audio? If you've done anything. Any other newsrooms on WhatsApp? And after today, will you try? I want to know if you had any like really bad like mistake, like what was your uh-oh moment? Did you ever do something and you're like, oh no, it's out and now we're gonna have to deal with it?
We've had some, I mean, Twitter Spaces is kind of wide open, so sometimes people will jump up and I've had people swear in the room and I'm like, oh, well, we'll have to edit that later. Moments like that have happened. We haven't really had anything too drastic happen. There might be like a time where a mic didn't work for a speaker or I had to fix a tech glitch really quickly, but nothing that's been like an awful moment that we had to rethink or anything.
I don't know if it's mistake, but each month we receive more than 100 new subscribers, new listeners who want to include in our list, and it's a very big challenge for us to updating our list. It's very, very complicated because now we have several lists and it's not easy. So it's not a mistake, but it's a very big challenge for us.
Any other questions? We have one over here. Oh, we have 2, 3. Oh, everyone woke up. I saw you first, I believe. Yes.
A question for both of you, I think. Working with the false information, I know where I work, we get to delete some Facebook messages or comments sometimes and stuff like that. If WhatsApp group, is that possible? And in Spaces, what do you do if someone, like, how do you fact check when you're live and the audience gets to participate live?
Yeah, so with Twitter Spaces, if I'm running the room, the little bit of moderation that I do when someone raises their hand is they go into a queue, so they're not brought on the stage directly and they'll just start talking. You actually get to like accept who you want to start talking within the space. I will kind of go through their profile, and usually if they're like, defund NPR is their first tweet, or they're like, they got something that I feel like they're very trolly to us, I'm probably not going to bring them up because I know what kind of conversation we're going to have, and I want to have one that's more back and forth with our reporters and not just someone attacking them. But if someone does start to say stuff or get to an attacking mode, before a space even starts, I kind of read what I call the rules of the room, and I say if you're going to attack or troll or say something that we have to like check on, we're actually going to remove you from the speaking privileges. So you can do that. You can't select someone and just remove them from the room and just boot them out. So that's something that we do, but we actually haven't had a lot of that. And I'm still very, very surprised because I know Twitter can be a rough place, but it has not happened too much. But we do have rules, and there is a way to moderate that in case someone does go off on a tangent or anything. I
think that Twitter it can be a rough place for people typing, but when it's time for them to use their voice, maybe they're not quite ready to be as trolly. How do you fact check?
Yes, I don't know if I have answer for your question, but on WhatsApp we have groups and lists. We don't have groups, we have just a list. And list, people can't send a message and everyone seen. So we send a message. We have, we send a message and only listeners can see. So a message who can receive, we are only receive, yes.
So the users are only sending to you and not to the whole group?
Exactly.
Okay, that's good. We had 2 more questions over here.
Hello, Matt. My question is a bit of a follow-up to that last one. It seems incredibly resource-intensive. So you were showing that the most success you had were, particularly around the State of the Union address. I imagine in that newsroom, the State of the Union address is happening. Every single reporter assigned to that is getting up their digital story, is going on the broadcast. How do you get somebody out of that melee to go and be speaking on the Spaces experience? And how many people, I suppose, are in the background for one of these events?
Background is in on production for it?
Yeah.
One, it's me. That's it.
How on earth do you
Yeah.
moderate it and do everything in that time? You must have 3 brains or
Yeah.
10.
I hope my boss heard all of that. That would be great. But I think, so for the State of the Union, usually that's an all-hands-on-deck thing where we have a lot of the politics in Washington desk already working on it. So I usually work with their senior editors to say, who has time to go to Spaces and have a conversation? And usually they'll have 1 or 2 reporters available to do Spaces. It's now part of our workflow where, yes, we have people going on air to talk about it and people to write digital stories, but Spaces is becoming something that someone might just work on that night. So we've actually started to separate that out to be someone's job to go on Spaces and have a conversation. So for that night, we had 3 reporters who were available, and so they started the conversation to kind of preview what the State of the Union was going to be like. We then went to the live audio, so they didn't need to talk during that. And then when the live audio ended, they came back in the room to have a conversation with the audience, and then that's where we went from there. So we've actually made it part of our workflow that a reporter is able to join this. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question? It was...
Do you have 10
production.
brains?
Yeah, yeah. So right now it's really just me, but I'm also training a lot of our reporters and our other social media engagement editors across the newsroom to learn to use this tool. So we're starting to roll out where other people are actually starting to launch this for our other accounts, like All Things Considered, Morning Edition. They're going to start running their own. So it is starting to branch from there. But when it started, it really was just me testing this and trying to figure it out from there. But it eventually will have more people working on it.
One last question, I believe. Yes.
Yes, for Matt. I think it's 2 questions. It's exciting that you use your broadcasting audio to Spaces and reverse. Is there any legal issues there, like who owns the audio when you produce it in Twitter? And is it? Have you ever tried to go live from Spaces in your own platforms?
So with the legal ramifications, Twitter is not doing anything with that audio. When it ends, it's just saved by us, and that's who's owning the recording from there. So they're not reusing it, they're not repurposing it anywhere. So it still stays under NPR copyright. We are trying to figure out, that's one of our next steps, is to try to figure out how to get Spaces into our live broadcast. And I've kind of figured out a way to do it, but we're going to experiment more with it. What excites me, though, is I have had some followers on Twitter tweet at us and say, oh, it was in my car, and I live streamed it via their car, and they were listening to NPR via Twitter Spaces. So that's something else that we're going to try to figure out, how to do that, how to get some of that audio into on-air while it's live. That is kind of the next step we're trying to think about.
That is our time. Thank you both very much. Thank you for joining.